Good afternoon. It is June 10th, day 43 of my vlog. We're still in the wilderness. Feels like we're still in the wilderness, doesn't it? And today's title is In the Wilderness, Very Human Leaders. Moses, God's man, God's leader, was very human. As a young man, 1 to 40 years old, he was arrogant and he was a murderer. And he also believed in God as a young man. In his middle age, 40 to 80 years old, he was broken and hopeless. He felt put on a shelf by God, like God could never possibly use him again. Then God comes to him in the burning bush, and he's reluctant to obey God, to follow God at the age of 80. He tried to say no to God. He argues with God. He even frustrates God a little bit. God gives in and gives him Aaron to help him, but God's pretty much telling him no more arguments. And then ages 80 to 120 years old, Moses is overwhelmed by the job God has given him to do. I mean, his father-in-law says to him, "What are you doing? You can't do this." And in Deuteronomy 1:12, Moses says, "How can I myself alone bear you?" And then at the end of his life, he shows how human he is, because he strikes the rock when God told him only to speak to it to get water out of it. And he dishonored God, Numbers 20, 9 to 13. And God is disappointed in him, to say the least. Actually, Moses says he was angry with me. Now you take other leaders like Aaron and Miriam. Their humanity, their weakness, their failures showed up, and they rebelled against Moses, against God's anointed leader. That's Numbers chapter 12. Joshua in 1 tells us that Joshua was full of fear, afraid to lead God's people. Jeremiah in chapter 1 verse 28, God says, "Don't be afraid of their faces, because you will be afraid of their faces." That's human. God's leaders are very human. It's hard to be a leader for God when you yourself are very human. All this is to say that if your leader that God has given you is human, there's no excuse. That is no excuse for rejecting him as God's leader, because that's what God gave you. There is no other kind of leader out there. They're human. They have failures. They have sins. I have sins. God almost killed Miriam because of her complaining about Moses' leadership. Numbers 12:14, he strikes her down with leprosy. The other side of this is that God's leader knows that he is weak. He knows he is a sinner. He knows that the struggle that he himself has gives the people he's following a struggle to be around him. They have legitimate complaints about him, and God's leader knows that. And that's painful to know that our failures as leaders, my failures as leaders, cause God's people to struggle. It's really very painful. And there's really nothing I can do about it, or Moses for that matter. And Moses doesn't defend himself. Moses responds to Miriam and Aaron's challenge to his leadership with silence. Numbers 12:3 says, "Now this man Moses was the meekest man on the earth." He could have exercised authority. That's the Bible word for taking charge. You know, I'm in charge, shut up. But he didn't. He was also obviously grieved for Miriam and Aaron, knowing that God was not going to be pleased with them, that they were going to have a problem. He cared for them in the passage. When God comes after Miriam and Aaron, Moses stands up to God for them. And so he's hurting because the ones he's standing for are not standing for him. Think about this. Moses was meek before them, but bold before God. Say that again. Meek before them, but bold before God. Shouldn't it have been the other way around? But see, when you're God's leader, that is how you are supposed to respond. I, as God's chosen leader, often forget that I'm supposed to be meek before people and bold before God. How do you lead God's people? Lastly, and this is maybe the only reason I can get through this, is God defends his leader. God strikes Miriam down with leprosy. And then when Moses prays for her and she's healed of the leprosy, God says she should be ashamed of herself for 7 days. Hebrews 13:17 puts it this way. It's not profitable for God's people to not follow God's leader. In the wilderness, accept the humanness, the weakness of God's chosen leader. Pray for him. And remember this, God knew how human the man he chose, the woman he chose to lead you was when he chose them. May God bless you. Amen.